Right, we'll get started. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Team-Based Learning in the Online Classroom. I'm Haley Diaz, your host for today's event. And before the presentation, let's just knock out some logistics. One, today's presentation is being recorded and it will be distributed to all attendees within the next 24 hours. Two, there are a couple of Zoom features we'll be using today and would love your participation in them. The Q&A feature is for any questions you may have for our presenter, Austin, today. I will see those and share them with him during the Q&A part at the end of the presentation so he can answer those. And if we don't get to your individual question, Austin will make sure to follow up with you after the session. And the chat feature is just for general inquiries. Feel free to post anything in there you would like to share with the whole group. And finally, we would love to get social with today's event. We'll be tweeting today using a hashtag that's at the bottom of your screen, hashtag #LunchWithLeo. And to follow along and participate, just search for the hashtag in the search bar of Twitter and then click on latest. We believe we learn best as a community, so we're always happy to hear your thoughts. And with that all taken care of, let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce today our presenter, Austin Rutledge. With more than a decade of experience working in education and a Master of Science in Education from the University of Tennessee, Austin is passionate about working to improve student outcomes at every level of education. Austin has taught at every level, from middle school to university courses, and has spent the last 4 years working alongside faculty in every possible setting, from primary grade classrooms to medical school laboratories, in an effort to increase student engagement and improve retention. While much of Austin's expertise lies in technology integration, his focus is always on finding the right pedagogical approach regardless of the role technology may play. And with that, I'm happy to turn things over to Austin.
All right, thanks Haley for that. And I do just want to point out, as Haley had mentioned, I've kind of been around a few places. I've taught in high school. I taught as a graduate assistant at Tennessee when I was there. And even now I love that I get to serve as adjunct faculty and kind of still scratch that teaching bug that I get from time to time. So it's a lot of fun. And I do want to get kind of straight into, because I know this is just a 30-minute webinar, and so we want to jump right in with today's topic. So, these are kind of the objectives we're focusing on today. Team-based learning and, everything around that, from the readiness assessment, readiness assurance test to all of the other parts and moving parts of TBL, and especially how do we do that in a online environment. So before we get too far into it, though, I do want to explore this idea of why team-based learning, why is TBL kind of becoming this more focused approach to teaching, especially in the health sciences education. We're starting to see TBL really take off as an approach to teaching and learning. And I think the thing that you see here in this image, to me, what stands out is collaboration. And as Haley was saying, we do really feel that learning as a community is important. And when you allow students that opportunity to really, talk to each other and to share their understanding of a topic and maybe correct any misunderstandings based on another student's experience. All of those experiences can come together and really help those students to really make sure they learn the material first before they, try to just sit back and memorize it and walk into an exam. And, it's really focusing on learning and applying the material. And so with that in mind, I do want to walk through the team-based learning workflow. A lot of you are probably very familiar with this. You've been doing team-based learning, probably some of you in a live environment, maybe for some time. TBL has been around for decades. But for those of you who maybe are new to the concept, team-based learning, the workflow for this is really these kind of 5 steps. And you could add that 6th part of, and we'll talk about peer evaluations in a little bit. But these are really kind of the main components of that TBL workflow. So students are preparing for class in advance. And this is critical. This is an important part for students showing up ready to participate. And we'll talk about some ideas about how to encourage that and make that work. Once they arrive to class, they are confronted immediately with the readiness assurance testing, or RATs. So you'll often hear the term IRAT referring to an individual readiness assurance test, or a TRAT or a GRAT, if you want to call it a group readiness assurance test. And so these are typically, anywhere from 5 to 20 questions, usually, standard multiple choice questions, but they're oftentimes not going to be written at those lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy. These are questions that really encourage students to apply the learning that they've done in preparation for class. And so what usually happens is the students show up, they take their individual test just themselves. They, are in the classroom taking that test. And then once that test is over, and again, they're usually pretty short, 5 to 20 questions max, then you transition into the team readiness assurance test. And so oftentimes you'll see faculty using the exact same questions. And so what's important about the TRAT or GRAT is that students are going to get immediate feedback. And the form that most faculty tend to use for this are scratch-off cards. And so you often hear if-at cards in reference for that. And so essentially what happens is students can scratch off one of the answer choices, and if they're right, they see a star or a smiley face, and they know, hey, we got this question right on the first try. If they scratch, off a choice and they don't see a smiley face, and they're thinking, okay, well, that wasn't right, we need to try again. And so what is our next choice going to be of the ones that are remaining? And typically those are scored on a descending value. So students might not get as many points if they get it right on their second or third try as they would if they'd gotten right on their first try. So after that, and you can see, and I know a lot of you are probably thinking, okay, so that's great. Students are getting immediate feedback. We've talked a lot about feedback in our Lunch with Leo series so far. And that's one of the things I love about team-based learning is students are getting that immediate feedback from that TRAT activity. And so from there, just, kind of following the workflow here, students are going to have an opportunity to make any appeals or get feedback from the instructor. Instructors might be looking at item analysis questions, these stats from the IRAT or the TRAT to see, how are students doing, and are there questions that students maybe need a little bit of follow-up on. It's something that, trends that you notice. Sometimes even you might have a poorly phrased question in there, and that happens to all instructors. And none of us write perfect questions all the time. So looking at that item analysis kind of during those activities, if you have the ability to pull those stats in real time, that's going to give you an opportunity to address any misconceptions or misunderstandings that students might have. And that's also a time that students might start to formulate any appeals. And typically that comes in the form of, a formal written appeal. And so you might think about, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, how you could use your LMS to support that activity. And then kind of the last part of the in-class or, live TBL activity are these application exercises. And so, typically this is something where an instructor might present a case to students, a clinical vignette of sorts, and students have time to really digest and work through what are oftentimes pretty difficult questions. And I apologize for the dog. If you guys can hear the dog barking in the background, I do apologize for that. But these application exercises are really important for taking that next step to really applying that knowledge, and even some of the things they might have learned, any misconceptions they might have corrected from the TRAT. As they're working through that, they might have realized, oh, so that's how that works. I didn't quite understand that process. Now in the application exercises, they can take that knowledge that they've already learned and cemented and then apply that there. And so the idea is they get confronted with these problems, allow the teams time to discuss and come to a consensus. That's really important. And then they report simultaneously. And that's one of the things that, people who train others in how to do TBL, that's one of the things I've seen that they really emphasize is that students report out their answers simultaneously so that they're not influenced by other teams in that. And so let's talk a little bit about, break down this workflow a little bit and talk about each of these components and how they work kind of in the online environment. So first of all, the flipped classroom, that's really what TBL is. It's a form of a flipped classroom. Flipped classroom is kind of this big, overarching idea of how you can do learning. And TBL is just, kind of fits within that bubble for sure. And so when it comes to flipped classrooms, some of the things that I really encourage people to do is to set really clear expectations of, what do I need to do before class? And it's, as you see on the slide, don't just say, watch this video and come to class prepared to discuss. Because that the video might encompass, 7 or 8 different learning objectives. So that's definitely something to think about when it comes to how you communicate to students before class. Maybe say, watch this video, write down your key takeaways for each of the learning objectives addressed. And so that might give them a little bit more focus of, okay, this is what I need to be doing in preparation for class. And then, holding them accountable for that preparation is important. One of the great things about team-based learning as a flipped classroom approach is that accountability is kind of built right in with those readiness assurance tests. And that's really why they're there, is it really helps to encourage students to be prepared, because they're going to be held accountable to themselves, but also to a team when they arrive in class. And then, I've had a lot of instructors and often thought myself a lot of times, what am I going to do if students aren't prepared? What do you do when they show up and it's obvious that they didn't watch this video, they didn't complete this activity, they didn't, they didn't meet the expectations that I set forth? And so when that happens, I think one of the best things you can do is just have a conversation with those students. And, oftentimes there might be a really valid reason why they weren't prepared for class. I mean, students have a lot going on. So, having that conversation first, I think, is a great way to address that. And then also kind of staying informed of their progress on pre-class activities can maybe help to prepare you for those conversations. For example, if your learning management system, and I know Leo with Da Vinci, we really focus on making it evident to faculty and administrators if students have access course materials. And so you can go in and see that history of the course materials. So that's one way to think about, preparing in advance if those conversations need to be had. And then obviously, if you feel like there's a lot of students that aren't coming to class prepared, it might be something that you need to reassess some of the pre-class work. I know there have been times that I have assigned, in a flipped classroom approach, I assigned students, hey, yeah, I need you to work through all of this. And then I realized, hey, not many students did that. Maybe there was something wrong with that assignment. Maybe the instructions weren't as clear as I thought they were. So maybe going back and reassessing the pre-class work is a helpful thing to do as well. And then I do encourage you, proceed as planned. Don't, just if, you have some students show up unprepared, don't just stop and do a mini lecture every time. That's really kind of defeats the purpose, and it doesn't really honor the students that did follow instructions. So I would encourage you to go ahead and proceed as planned. If you want to include some kind of focusing activities at the very beginning of class, I read recently in a great blog about having a slideshow going before class starts with some trivia questions, maybe related to the content. And so that might be a way to kind of get students focused and thinking about the material as well. Again, continuing this idea of, what do you do with a flipped classroom? How do you prepare them? How do you offer the material? One of my favorite ways is e-learning content. So building out these modules, oftentimes SCORM modules that you can load into your learning management system that allow students to interact with the learning material. But it doesn't have to just be, SCORM content. I mean, you can do some really neat stuff with things like PowerPoint in terms of students, click here to advance to this slide and kind of create a choose your own adventure type of learning module there. Thinking about embedding quizzes and things, and so they get a little bit of formative feedback even before they show up to class is always really helpful. Are you providing, and again, thinking about this from an online perspective, can you provide them access to any type of study aids or materials? I know one of my favorite tools is Quizlet, something I actually started using when I was teaching middle school, but I've used even with my students at the college level, is providing these little Quizlets that I can embed in my learning management system, and students can go through and they can just check their understanding real quick. So, and then as students arrive in class, again, thinking back to those focusing activities, maybe a short think group share, especially if you're in an online learning environment. I know Dan talked a little bit about that last week with small group learning. Maybe, instead of a lecture at the beginning of the class, maybe a 5-minute think group share to have students focus on some of those key takeaways from that pre-class work. And so, as I said before, don't just assign a slide deck or say read this chapter in a book. Really provide some clear expectations and give them context for what they should be focused on. So I mentioned being able to access and see if students are doing the work. And so as you can see here, this is a screenshot from Leo, and you can see these students in this course have access. This is the team-based event preparation, and we can see the time that they downloaded. In this case, it was a slide deck they were accessing, but you can also have links to videos and other things in there that you can see who's clicking on this information. So that's a great way to track and see what type of participation is going on, even before students show up to class. That might prepare you if you need to really address those shortcomings that students might have. So students show up to class, and you have this, IRAT and GRAT, or IRAT and TRAT. And so what do you do for that? And so the IRAT is pretty straightforward. You can use, just a quiz in your learning management system and assign that to all your individual students. But a TRAT is a little bit more complicated. Most learning management systems that I've seen don't really duplicate the scratch-off card that you see here in this image. This is kind of on the left-hand side of the screen. You're seeing, a picture of one of these scratch-off cards, and so the students are scratching to see if they got it right. But the digital version of that in Leo, as you see on the right, are students just clicking to, and they're confirming, did I get this question right? And they're getting this, little frowny face or the smiley face eventually, hopefully, when they get the question right. I think this student is going to get it right on B. Yes, there you go. So you can see they got 1 point, and you can also see how the point values kind of descend in nature there. And so they got it right on their 4th try, so they only got 1 point. If they hadn't got it right on their 4th try, they wouldn't have gotten any points. So that's, definitely incentive for them to work and communicate together as a team and to come to consensus about these choices, because they're all really, concerned about the points that they're going to make. I know when I've worked in medical schools and other health science settings, I know that these students are definitely very high performing and very focused on getting as many points as they can to succeed in school. So one important point I want to make for the scratch-offs, you really only need, in a virtual setting, you really only need one student to open up that exam and the scratch-off exam, and they can just share their screen within a breakout room of whatever video conferencing tool you're using. They can share their screen with all the others, and then they can discuss, and that student can kind of just be the one to click once everybody confirms, yes, click here or click there. One of the things, as I was thinking about this and preparing for this presentation, it occurred to me, this really could help to overcome in a virtual setting some of the shortcomings and difficulties I've seen people have had when trying to implement interprofessional education. So for example, I've heard and seen presentations at conferences where people will invite students from pharmacy school or physician's assistant program or from a nursing school, and they'll have these students work together on certain cases. And I think this is a perfect opportunity in a team-based learning environment, because oftentimes one of the big limitations is that we're not using the same learning management system. Or even if we are using the same learning management system, your students are not in our system. And so what do we do to solve that problem? And so being able to share screens is really helpful with that. And then what's great is that the reports are going to provide you with all those scores that can be shared confidentially with those other instructors at those other schools. And so all of that can be shared. It takes a little bit of time on the front end, obviously, to think about how students are going to be grouped and who's going to be grouped with who. But definitely, feasible in a way to think about doing IPE in health sciences with TBL. And so I mentioned small groups, and one of the great things about Leo is we allow you to create linked events and assign exams, assignments, and other things to students based on those small group sets. And you can even create separate events for each group. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But utilizing those small group sets will aid you in creating those breakout rooms, because you can do those CSV or comma separated values exports from this system and import those into your video conferencing tools. So to kind of prepare those breakout rooms in advance and kind of help save some time, hopefully with the assigning and dragging and selecting, all those different boxes. So that's one thing to consider as you think about and plan and prepare for TBL in a virtual setting. So moving on past that, that if-at period, and thinking about the period of time where students, you might have some discussion. I really encourage you, looking down here at this bullet point in the middle, to think about item analysis. And as students are completing the group readiness assessment, or the TRAT, that would be a great opportunity for faculty to go back and pull up the item analysis from the IRAT and to see, how were students doing with this concept, and are there certain questions that I really do want to address? And that would be a perfect opportunity following that group readiness assessment, is to spend some time with an item analysis, share those results with the students, show them, this majority of students, or the average for this question was this, and, maybe explain why one choice was better than another. Maybe explain why this would have been a choice that a lot of people might have mistakenly chosen, but it's not right because of XYZ. And so that's a great opportunity to do that. And then I would encourage you to, use that time to remind your students that they want to submit any formal appeals for any questions. That they should do that either through a discussion board in a public forum, if you want to take that approach, or they can also just use the messaging built right into your LMS for any private messages, if you want them to share that in a private manner. And so that is definitely a great way to do that. I know Leo has those discussion boards available, and definitely when you log in, you can see the little inbox icon right at the top, so students can see if there are messages, and they can go there and send messages to faculty if they need to do so. So again, when it comes to those discussions, you do want to rely heavily on your video conferencing tools. That would be a time when you're bringing everybody back from the breakout room into the main room. And think about how you could use response tools in this too. If you want to follow up any misconceived questions with any other kind of polls or anything with students to see if they're starting to understand it a little bit better. Moving on from that period of time, I think that was step number 4 on my previous slide. The application exercises. This is where in an online environment, you really do need to consider, are we going to do this in a synchronous environment? So we're all going to do it together at the same time, kind of like we're all here watching this webinar, participating in this webinar together. So that's definitely something you want to consider. Are you going to do it at the same time, utilizing those breakout rooms and other tools within your video conferencing? You can utilize linked events in Leo. I talked about those a little bit earlier. Linked events allow you to share materials across events, but also to post separate materials within events for specific groups of students if needed. And students can have their own discussion boards within those events as well. So that's a good way for students to work together within those application exercises. And then don't forget to use those audience response tools. One of the things that's really cool, I was thinking about this a few days ago as in preparation for this, and that if you're embedding tools within your learning management system and you're utilizing linked events, so different groups have different events, you can embed the same content in multiple events. And actually, Leo allows you to do that in just one place, and it goes to all of them. And then everybody's going to see the same thing. Even though they're going to a different event, they're still going to see the same embedded content. So if it's live content like Nearpod or some other type of audience response tool, they're all going to see that live at the same time. It's going to work simultaneously. So it's a really cool idea to think about. Asynchronous application exercises. So this is where you want to, this is something I didn't really think about this too much until I dug into this topic and thought about, what, if you're doing online TBL, those application exercises don't have to just start and stop within that time frame of class. They can extend beyond that, and you can give students opportunities to really investigate those problems and provide their responses. And maybe, when you bring them back together at the beginning of the next class session, you could, have a short discussion about those before you move on to your next topic. So definitely some ways to do that. I think I may have plugged Flipgrid in every single Lunch with Leo that I've participated in so far. It's a great tool. It embeds right into your learning management system, and it's a way for students to really engage each other through video. So check that out if you haven't already. It's one of the tools I love utilizing with my students, and they seem to respond pretty well to that. As well as, just using assignments in your LMS. I know Dan talked about some great ways last week in the small groups discussion to have your students work asynchronously with each other and, submit assignments or whatever it might be in your LMS. So there's some great ideas here as well for how you could extend that TBL time beyond just the 1 hour block or the 2 hour block that you normally would use. And so I do want to finish up real quickly so we can have some time for questions, but it is important to offer feedback for peers and faculty when it comes to TBL. And, think about how you want to structure that. My recommendation is to not just have students fill out a 1 to 5 scale for each student. I would encourage you, and I think Dan talked a little bit about this last week as well, really providing some open-ended responses. And this sample here on this screen, it might be a little bit hard for some of you to see, but basically there are 2 questions at the end that are open-ended and says one thing you appreciate about this person and one thing you would request of this person. So I think that's a simple phrase to say, hey, what are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What could they improve? And really provide more rich feedback. And again, I would do this multiple times throughout the course and not just at one point at the end. That way students get formative feedback about how they're participating within their groups. And then finally, I know Dan likes this idea, and as I watched his webinar last week, I was like, yes, that's great. This idea of follow-up video. When you get appeals from students or questions about application exercises, don't be afraid to just hop on, create a quick 5-minute video, explain the concepts to your students, and then post that for everyone to see. It's a great way to honor the individual students' requests, but also share that content with other students who might have the same question, but weren't really sure if they should ask or not. So just again, before we get to our questions, some quick tips that I found in some of my research. It's really important to orient your students to TBL. So introduce them to the technology, but also to the concept and why you use TBL, some of the important concepts that you base your TBL experiences on. Maybe provide students some time to really form and gel in their teams. So encourage, some of those short team building exercises, some ideas there. And then I mentioned interprofessional education before. I think TBL, especially virtual TBL, is a great opportunity for that. These 4 kind of tenets here, these are come straight from the Team-Based Learning Collaborative. They have a great website with a lot of resources. And they're kind of the ones I think that do a lot of the training. I know at Da Vinci, we have utilized TBL and implemented TBL in the classroom, but we're by no means the ultimate experts on team-based learning. We're always learning from other people as well. And these people, the TBL Collaborative, are definitely some of the people that we're always learning from as well. So I have a few references here. Those will be available in the slide deck you guys will get. And other than that, I know we're running right up on time, but Haley, were there any questions that people had or wanted to talk about today?
Yeah, thanks. I was going to say that concludes our webinar today. Thanks, Austin, for a super engaging and very informative presentation. Great job. And so, yeah, we did have a couple of questions roll into the chat. And as a reminder, just feel free to throw them in there. But from one of our attendees, they asked, can groups be uploaded to Zoom?
So,
So.
yeah, so with Zoom, I know some of these different video conferencing tools are different. I do know Zoom allows you to import a CSV file to create those breakout rooms in advance. And so that's one of the things I really like about being able to build those groups within Leo is that you can export them right into Zoom. Good question.
Awesome. Yeah, that is a great question. And another one of our attendees said or asked, can you suggest sources of online if-at cards or interfaces?
Yeah,
Great
so
question.
with regards to the online scratch-off cards, Leo actually has that built right into their system. And so you can do the scratch-off. So when you're building an exam in Leo, you can actually choose that as an option, and that exam can become a scratch-off. And you can actually use it not just with GRATs. You can use it for individual exams as well, although and you wouldn't want to use it with the IRAT in a TBL setting because then they would have the answers for the TRAT. So, but it is a great tool, that scratch-off. Yes.
That's a great tool. Thank you. And I think we'll just take one more since we're right at time here. So thanks everybody for your patience and willing to hang on. At one point from another attendee, you mentioned e-learning content. Where did you get this? Does someone make it? What's SCORM?
Yeah, so when I talk about e-learning content, usually this is more interactive content that is being created. And so it can be created in multiple different types of authoring tools. I know there are many out there like Articulate 360, Adobe Captivate, and actually quite a few others. I'm not coming to mind right off the top of my head. I think those are a couple of the top two. But essentially what you're doing with those authoring tools is you're kind of building that interactive experience where students are, getting the content and they can, click on things to reveal answers, or they can drag and drop answers to each other. It's a little bit more interactive than you would find in a typical quiz or exam in any learning management system. And it allows students, you can embed videos. There's all kinds of ways that you can track student participation and what they're clicking on and things like that. And when I say SCORM is really the way that content is delivered to a learning management system. So you would take that authoring tool and you would, when you save it, you would have a SCORM file that you would then upload to your LMS, and then students would be able to access that. And what's really great about those tools is that the SCORM content will report their score into the LMS, and it can be added right into the gradebook. At least in Leo, I know you can take those answers and export them straight into the gradebook from the SCORM content.
All right, thank you so much, Alton. And so that concludes our question and answer session. And we are right at time. So if you have any further questions or think of any later, you can feel free to reach out to us individually. So just a big thanks again to Austin and for everyone in attendance today about our webinar, Team-Based Learning in the Online Classroom. We'll make sure to share the recording with you in an email and follow up with anyone if they have any questions individually. And two quick things, housekeeping before we head out. First is our Da Vinci office hours, as you can see right here, for our current client partners. Just a great way to get your questions answered quickly or just to talk something out with our team. It'll be tomorrow at noon Eastern time. And the topic for tomorrow's office hours is managing IRAT and GRAT exams in Leo. How apropos. And secondly, is our next Lunch with Leo webinar series, and that'll be Thursday, July 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And the topic for that will be using video to enhance your online teaching. So just be on the lookout for that registration link in your email. So with that, thanks again, everybody, for your participation and attendance in today's webinar. We really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, guys.